In this boundless universe, there was a myth that a truly great knight should wield a sword, but this myth was completely destroyed. A legendary spear master. He went out alone against crowds of enemies, and victory was always in his pocket. He was a true hero of the continent of Igrant. In the Civil War, he showed that the strength of one can rival the strength of 1,000. He was able to single-handedly stop a bloody civil war that destroyed many cities and took thousands of lives in the Avalon Empire. This greatest spearman was named Joshua Sanders. During the war, he was a middle-aged man with silver hair and a light beard of the same color, and his eyes shone blue like the sea under the rays of the sun. And so, such a great lancer was betrayed by his former associates, one of which was a magician in white robes. He stood and watched Joshua, spitting blood at death, and said that a man was waiting for a miserable end. Lancer didn't understand, so he asked why they did it. It happened in a dark forest, at night, when the moon reached the zenith. When he asked, another trader in a black robe said that the guy used mana better than anyone, but magic and sacred power are opposite to each other, one might say hostile. And now these two forces collided in the body of a man. And if Lancer had been an ordinary man, he would have died instantly, falling under the weight of pain. Joshua raised his head looking at them and asked again why they did it. He never needed a throne, power, or even titles. His only desire and goal was to show this world the true power of the spear and get rid of the label of bastard son of a concubine. He did everything he could to help his friend and the emperor stop the protracted civil war in Avalon. He wanted to be a shield for the empire and a support for his friend Kaiser Ben Britain, the emperor of Avalon. But his friend, a middle-aged man with golden hair reaching just below his shoulders and the same eyes, now standing here among these traitors, looked at him with cold, waiting for Joshua to die. He didn't want much, but why? Wondering, he spat blood again. And the magician in white at that time told him that he should understand that there are people whose very existence is a threat. The magician, in a white robe, was an Evergrande, the lord of the magic tower. He was an old man with gray hair, a mustache and a beard reaching to the collarbone, and right now he was saying that when the war was over, they had no enemies left and the emperor's power was unlimited. He had great things to do, but the emperor was still afraid of one variable, and that variable was him, Joshua, the great spear master. Joshua grabbed his chest, bursting with pain, and looked with anger at these people. But the lord of the tower did not finish. He went on to say that warriors who study mana techniques all their lives need dozens of years to learn how to use them, even with a simple dagger. And Joshua was fighting with a huge spear that two people could hardly lift and at the same time perfectly manipulated mana in battle. Joshua has slain not dozens or hundreds, but thousands of enemies. Even before he became a master of mana control, he did things that would never have occurred to a simple warrior before, and it was frightening. The magician poured more money into his magic ball, and feeling unbearable pain, Lancer wanted to tear out his chest and pull out this pain. The ball that the lord of the tower used was a magical item that turned the land of Ammon into ruins. In the direction of the man writhing in pain, a leg in armor stepped in, and another voice was heard saying that he was also afraid. Just the sight of Joshua's spear inspired him with fear. Even if Joshua was not around, a man with black hair and a face full of wrinkles drove him crazy with the thought that if the greatest lancer wanted to, there would be no salvation for him. The pain became unbearable. Blood gushed from all the pores of the spearman, and the sky turned red because of the sunrise. The magician in white, bowing to him, thanked him, because if he had not been there, then they would not have been there, and the lord of the tower was sincerely grateful that he had such a friend. With an ugly smile, the magician said goodbye to the man and poured more mana into the ball. Lying on the ground covered in blood and unable to even lift his head, Joshua could only clench his teeth tighter in this state. The emperor, looking with contempt at his dying friend, said that he could no longer watch his best friend die like this, and turned around and went. Enraged and putting all his last strength, Joshua shouted his friend's name and said that it would not end like this. But the traitors no longer looked at him and went on grinning. On the ground under Joshua, a blue magic circle with a star in the center and Ravna runes written around the star flared up. Every rune and every line in it glowed with this mysterious light, which made it even scarier. Seeing the magic, Joshua recognized him immediately. It was the explosive magic famous during the wars, and the spell that had already reached such a state could not be stopped. Naturally, he could not be an exception either. He had only 5 minutes left on the force. Hitting the ground, he said, "Is he the greatest spear master? No, it's all nonsense." He considered himself a pathetic knight who had been betrayed by a friend and would soon die ingloriously in a nameless forest. The wind swirled around him, and his spear, lying not far from the magic circle, glowed red. Seeing the reaction of his beloved spear, the crimson Rugia, who was called the Reaper of Battle, he began to weave along the ground to his only remaining true friend. Of course, he suspected that the spear had a hidden power. But why now? The man shouted to his body to move, because his only friend who was with him always called him. The spear was enveloped in an orange aura with glints of gold, and Joshua was only a couple of meters away from reaching it. And with the last effort, he grabbed his spear and closed his eyes from impotence. At the same time, the ground cracked under him, and flashes of light and air burst out of the cracks. The earth began to swell, more and more, and after a few seconds it swelled up to a meter and with a loud sound exploded with a column of light. and Joshua was floating, or rather already disappearing in the center of this pillar, which later turned into a ball. Joshua Sanders was the Duke of the Avalon Knight Empire, and he met a ridiculous death not worthy of an invincible spear master. In a haystack, a boy with dark blue hair woke up screaming and looking back at the stable, asked where he was. The boy was wearing a white shirt and orange shorts, one might say simple peasant clothes. Looking at his body, the boy remembered the explosion that enveloped and completely vaporized him. The realization came to his head and he ran out of the stable and saw the well. There was a bucket of water next to the well, and looking at his young reflection, Joshua was perplexed. Then, pulling himself together, he looked around. Blue roses, horses in the stable, chewing hay all the time in a wooden house. He was back in the past. Laughing, he clenched his fist. It was his second chance and of course he will take it. Now everything will be different in this life. While Joshua was clenching his hand into a fist and imagining the future with a grin, he was called. Looking back, he saw 3 soldiers in military uniforms. The typical military uniform of the Agnos family is green, made of orc skin. Not the strongest equipment, but quite strong. The very first soldier with longer brown hair of a red hue shouted at him that Josh was ordered to clean up horse manure, so what the hell he was hanging around here. Joshua frowned at them. These bastards were the soldiers of Duke Agnos, Lloyd, Gortz and their commander Rolls. Lloyd had longer brown hair, a red hue and was more fit than his friends. Gortz, on the other hand, had a darker cinnamon color and had a muscular body. Rolls, of all 3, looked the frailest. He had the same brown hair, but with a yellow tinge and it was combed back. His physique was thin. This man, Lloyd, looking at him with anger and contempt told him to answer. And then the second one, with yellow-brown hair combed back, told Lloyd that he seemed to have forgotten that the guy was mute and he would not be able to answer him. All these years, Joshua pretended to be mute because any word could be a reason for him to be beaten by these 3. Lloyd, looking around, said that he hadn't seen Lucy lately, and his friend shouted for him to be quiet because the Duke could hear him. Hers has already searched this maid if he calls her by her name so brazenly. Lucy was Joshua's mother, a beautiful, young woman with sky blue hair and turquoise eyes. She was a servant in the house of Agnos, and one day the Duke took her by force, and from this connection he was born an unwanted bastard. Although the guy had the blood of an aristocrat, no one cared about it. The Duke's soldiers, who knew the truth, mocked him and enjoyed it. He was especially ridiculed by these Troya, Gord, a man with short brown hair, Lloyd, the one who ordered him to speak, and Rolls, a man with his hair combed back. Lloyd, smiling, asked Rolls if he missed him. Rolls elbowed him and advised Lloyd to shut up. What would he do if someone heard him? Smiling, Lloyd told him not to sweat, because there is no one here, well, except that bastard. Rummage said he was probably right. Smiling villainously, Lloyd told his friend to remember what Duchess Vanessa had told them. If they get rid of this maid and his starveling, then she will settle everything. Now was the time. It was a pity that Lucy was not here. Rolls nodded at his words, and Lloyd said that then there was no choice. They would only play with this guy. Of course, Rolls supported his friend. With anger burning inside, the guy said to himself that those who mock his mother will not get away with it. He clenched his fist and began to accumulate mana in it. Closing his eyes, he wondered if he could do it. In his previous life, he used mana in a completely different way than was customary. In the ancient ruins where the Rugia was hidden, he also took out a unique technique. This technique could even shake the heavens, and it was thanks to it that Joshua became so much stronger than the others so quickly. This secret technique was fundamentally different from the usual way of controlling mana. Instead of accumulating mana in an energy vessel inside his body and using it as needed, the technique allowed him to collect mana that was around him. In roses that bloom in the garden, in water that stands in the well, even in the air that he breathes. And with the help of technology, he accumulates with his whole body and not limited to just a vessel. Then you need to concentrate mana in the right part of the body and then a sharp release. Joshua had to learn for many years to create a mana vessel as others did. And thanks to this, he very quickly learned how to manipulate mana in the air. While Joshua was concentrating mana on his hand, Gort shouted, pushing his friends away, that he needed to beat this guy up properly, otherwise his sad face was pissing Gort off. Lloyd grinned and told his friend that he wanted to take it out on the kid for being dumped by a girl. And Gort screamed at him to shut his mouth. It's not like that at all. Lifting the stick up, Gort said that there would be no indulgences for the guy today. And then, surprised, asked that the guy was in a standing faint, or what. After all, Joshua, with his eyes closed, stood with his fists clenched. Laughing, Lloyd also looked at the guy and said that the kid really seemed to have passed out. Joshua himself was now completely focused on mana. He needed to collect at least some mana. He had been studying this for 10 years. And even with a special technique it was not easy, but, fortunately, he would not have to study a second time, because he already knows the way. Opening his eyes, he looked at the enemy and Gort even retreated from fear. When he came to himself, he shouted at the guy and shouted with a swing of his stick so that he wouldn't scare him like that. Having accumulated mana in his hand, the guy dodged the stick and hit Gort right in the solar plexus, which caused him to fall to the ground clutching his stomach. But the guy moved away, taking a fighting pose. Seeing this, Lloyd and Rolls leaned in perplexity, and Lloyd asked what it was at all. Feeling something in his core, Joshua thought with bewilderment that there was nothing there. And now he felt an unpleasant and sticky sensation from there. He had never experienced this before. At this time, Lloyd pulled his sword out of its scabbard and shouted that the guy had definitely decided to die today and approached him. In the body of a little boy. It is dangerous to fight against a man with a long sword, but if the guy manages to knock Lloyd down, then there is a chance that the thinking Rolls will not attack now. He was the most reasonable of the three of them. Concentrating once more, the guy looked at the approaching Lloyd, and crouching down, thanks to which the sword passed over him, he clenched his fist, concentrating mana there and hit Lloyd, who was confused at the last moment, right in the jaw. He flew off with a fountain of blood and crashed into the ground right in front of Rolls. Rolls nervously looked in the direction of the guy, thinking about where this kid got such strength. One more time could be called luck, but the second time it is definitely not so. Joshua, on the other hand, grimaced from the terrible pain in his arm, and he had only used a little mana, clenching his fist. The guy hoped for the ingenuity of Rolls, which allowed him to reach his rank. After all, in essence, he is weaker than Gorton Lloyd, but he still will not be able to cope with him in this state. But he shouldn't show weakness. He needs to bluff. The guy shouted to Rolls to tell everyone. Hearing the guy's voice, Rolls was shocked and asked if he could speak. But Joshua, not listening to him, approached him, saying that now anyone who dares to insult his mother, even if it is an officer of the Duke's army, Joshua swears by his name that anyone will pay. Sensing the murderous intent in the guy's gaze, Rolls recoiled and turned away and ran, shouting that the guy was a monster. And the guy himself, dying, fell unconscious. In the Duke's castle, in front of the entrance doors, there were two men and one guy about 22 years old. One of the men, with gray hair and in a dirty white jacket, told his comrades that he had heard that the mute Joshua from the stable had beaten 3 soldiers. The young red-haired janitor nodded and added that he had heard how to say that Joshua, all this time only pretended to be mute, and now he can speak. The third old man, with short gray hair and a green jacket, scratched his chin and said that the kid was 5 years younger than Mr. Pavel, beat 3 men, it's nonsense no other way. The first old man in a white jacket laughed, saying that of course it was nonsense, rumors and nothing more. The kid who couldn't even speak until yesterday, just couldn't finish off 3 soldiers with his bare hands. The second old man turned to him with concern that if it was still not nonsense, then it could affect the choice of the heir of Duke Agnos. The first old man, spreading his arms, shook his head, saying that even if it was not just rumors, he still could not defeat Mr. Pavel. A young man among them said that this was indeed the case, because Mr. Pavel already knows how to move mana. Grinning, the first old man also said that even Duke Agnos learned this only at 16, and everyone calls him a master and respects him, and his son. Pavel is only 14 and will soon turn old, so they themselves should guess what a great future he has. He can also be considered a genius, so there is no question of choosing an heir. While these 3 were talking, suddenly the door opened and Joshua entered. Seeing this, the first old man recoiled in surprise, and asked if Mr. Joshua had been here for a long time. Joshua, emitting a murderous aura, told him to tell the Duke that he was Joshua Agnos, had come to his call. In the Duke's study, in front of the table, sat the Duke himself, a stately man in ducal robes, with dark blue hair and the same color, a thick beard. Next to him, not far from the table, stood the same statuesque, but already a young man of 22-25 years old with short dark blue hair, but a lighter shade than that of the Duke. And the man was also dressed in luxurious noble clothes. Rolls was kneeling next to the table with his head bowed. The Duke, holding up a pen with which he was writing something, asked if he was rolling it. Rolls raised his head in a panic and said that yes, his name is Rolls. The Duke, not paying attention to him, while reading some sheet, asked what squad he was in, and Rolls Weight Pale said that he was in the 29th. The Duke turned to the man standing next to him and asked if it was in Griezmann. Chiffin, that was the name of the young man, replied that it was. The Duke beckoned with 2 fingers to Rose, telling him to give him these clothes, which were lying next to Rolls. Of course, he handed it over. Military clothing, green with gold patterns, was twisted and almost perforated. Seeing this, the Duke with a gloomy face asked Rolls what he said was done by Joshua. The young man warned Rolls to think twice before answering. If he lied, then let him not expect mercy. Startled by the threat, Rolls nodded and said it was done by Joshua. Then, with a pale face, he said that he really wasn't lying. The Duke asked Chiffin what he thought about it and he honestly replied that it was hard to believe. The Duke nodded, saying he was of the same opinion, and then asked how old Joshua was. Chiffin, with an impassive face, said that Tom was 9 years old. The Duke once again looked at the clothes and stroking his beard, said that to do this with clothes made of orc skin in 9 years, and even with bare hands, although with the help of mana, it could be possible. Chiffin's lemon-colored eyes turned to the Duke and his vertical pupils, then as a jet, narrowed even more and Chiffin apologized to the Duke, but still said that it was impossible. Chiffin, gesticulating with his hand, said that in the history of the continent, there were no children who could use mana at the age of 9. And even if we assume that such a genius has appeared, in order to use mana with his bare hands, you need to be at least at the level of a B-class knight. Based on this, Chiffin simply could not believe that these damages could have been inflicted by Mr. Joshua. Enraged, Chiffin turned to Rolls and shouted that it was more likely that these soldiers were afraid of punishment for their mockery of Mr. Joshua and therefore came up with such nonsense. Rolls shuddered in fear, recoiled, and Chiffin, with even greater fury, said that if the Duke allowed it, he would take Rolls to the soldiers and punish him as required by the regulations. Pale and even blue with fright, Rolls, with his head bowed, begged to be believed because he was telling the truth. Chiffin, putting his hand on the hilt of his sword, said, Rolls, that he dared to raise his voice in front of his lordship. Let him admit why he thought of it. Retreating in fear, Rolls swore that he had told the truth and asked to believe him. Chiffin drew his sword a little and said that Rolls didn't seem to want to repent, but the Duke ordered Chiffin to stop. Chiffin wanted to object, saying that this liar should not be left just like that, but the Duke got up from his seat and said that they would meet the hero of the story. It's time to take a walk. Surprised by this, Chiffin thought that the Duke decided to personally meet with the son of his mistress, and even Mr. Pavel, who is called a genius, did not bother with this honor. The Duke, already on his way out of the office, asked where Joshua lived, and Chiffin replied that he was in the mansion, most likely waiting in the reception room on the ground floor. Nodding to this Duke, he told Chiffin to follow him. The corridor of the Agnos mansion. There was a young guy with golden hair and blue eyes, but he suddenly stopped, and in anger shouted at the guy who was standing in the hallway. What was he doing here? The guy standing in the hallway was Joshua, and now he was enveloped in a gloomy aura. Now the guy was looking at the portrait of the current emperor, Marcus Ben Britain, a man of advanced age with combed-back blonde hair and a neat beard of the same color, felt only hatred and anger. Before his eyes appeared his friend, who betrayed him so meanly. Clenching his fists, he once again promised himself that he would take revenge on Kaiser Ben Britain. Suddenly there was a voice behind him in anger, asking him how long he was going to ignore his question. The fist flew swiftly towards Joshua, but he tilted his head, caught the fist with his palm, and then filling his palm with a little mana squeezed his brother's fist. The golden-haired guy's face turned pale from the pain, but the golden-haired guy inside thought that it looked like Joshua had really killed 3 soldiers. But deciding that it was not important, he also concentrated mana in his hand and wanted to hit, but then the Duke came into the corridor and seeing this asked what was going on. The golden-haired guy jumped back, looked at his father in surprise, and Joshua also turned in surprise. The golden-haired guy, bowing his head and kneeling on one leg, said that he was greeting his lordship, and the Duke asked what was going on. Pavel said that it was a friendly greeting, and the Duke raised one eyebrow doubtfully, and then looked at Joshua standing there and he just nodded. Chiffin, surprised by the guy's behavior, thought that Joshua had gone crazy because instead of answering, he just nodded. Then he took a step towards the guy and told him to show manners in front of the Duke. Joshua turned to him and Chiffin, seeing that he was in no hurry to be polite, shouted that he did not stand like a pillar, but greeted him properly. The Duke stopped Chiffin, saying that the boy's eyes were full of hatred. The guy looked at his father with hatred and an aura of malice. But when he came to himself, he looked at the ground. Because of the portrait, he remembered Kaiser's face and therefore he is filled with anger and rage. His emotions are out of control. He urgently needs to do something, because Agnos does not spare those who do not show proper respect, even if his son does not show respect. The Duke, seeing that the guy calmed down a little, called him over and said that he himself would check if he really owned mana. Hearing this, Pavel looked at Joshua in surprise, thinking about what kind of mana his father was talking about. Because this fool cleans the stables. Grinding his teeth, he could barely contain his anger. Chiffin, also surprised, asked if his lordship was sure, but the Duke just told Joshua to come over. Joshua himself was in a panic, because the Duke was a master of mana control. There were only 5 of them in the whole empire. If he notices something strange in Joshua's body, then the guy will be finished. The Duke grabbed the guy by the hand and wrapped his hand in mana and exclaimed in surprise that it was impossible. If the Duke's intuition allowed him to discover something that Joshua didn't know, then all his plans would be ruined. Looking at the Duke with concern, the young man waited for the verdict. The Duke himself raised one eyebrow in surprise, saying that he was not there. There was no mana, so the Duke let go of Joshua's hand. Pavel, grinning at such an event, thought to himself that of course there is no mana. Chiffin, smiling, told the Duke that he had told him this, but the Duke interrupted him and said that he was not talking about the mana vessel. Any living being should have mana. Both humans and magical creatures have it, but Joshua didn't have it. Chiffin, surprised by this, thought that if the guy doesn't have his mana, does he look like an undead? It was very strange. Then, putting his hand on his chin, he said that he had heard about children who were born without mana. The Duke said that this was not the case and looked at his fingers with a gloomy face and thought that there was some sticky and unpleasant clot in the place where the mana vessel should be. In general, smiling, he said that it was necessary to observe. Chiffin, realizing this, turned to the Duke, saying that if he was right, it meant that the rumors that Joshua had mana were false. If this is the case, then they should punish those who spread these rumors. The Duke said that soldiers and officers are part of their home. It is not worth being too strict, especially considering that there is not enough information yet. Chiffon, bowing, said that it would be as the Duke wished. The Duke then turned to Joshua, saying that he would stay here for the time being, and there were plenty of free rooms. Hearing this, Paul exclaimed that Joshua did not. But the Duke, without letting him finish, frowning his eyebrows, asked him with emphasis that he did not agree with him, and Pavel moderated his drinking and looking away, said that there was no way. Then the Duke turned to Chiffon, ordering him to teach Joshua the basics of knightly skill. Then he added that if the guy pulls, then let him also begin to train the mana techniques of the Scarlet Knights. Surprised by Chiffon, he asked that Joshua had no mana, how he could learn this. And the Duke turned around and folded his hands behind his back, said that they had plenty of time to check it out. It will be good if they were wrong. The Duke will return from Arcadia next year, and he will be looking forward to good results. Remembering the Duke's words, Joshua repeated them while sitting in his room. The Duke, who spends most of the year in Arcadia, the capital of Avalon, comes to his native domain to rest only from time to time. Joshua, looking at his hand, thought that it looked like the Duke had found something in him that he himself did not know about. But knowing something about yourself can be dangerous. It was clear to him that nothing was clear to him. Sighing, he got out of bed. Right now, the most important thing was to regain his strength. Clenching his fist, he thought to himself that he needed to train for this. On the night of the same day, Joshua jumped from the 5th floor by doing a somersault and landing on the roof of the 2nd, and then jumping on the ledges. He landed on the ground. Of course, he succeeded, thanks to the fact that he wrapped his feet in mana. It was getting a little easier to use mana. Maybe he could get his power back faster than he thought, although he had just thought about it. But his whole body was enveloped in pain from the inside, and the guy clutched his stomach. He felt that the clot in place of the vessel's mana began to move. Is there sacred power and magic there? No. Not only that, both were suppressed by the third energy. Rugia, this must be his spear. But how did the power of his spear end up in him and start suppressing these two forces? The guy suddenly heard the guards running towards him, asking each other if they had heard anything. One claimed to have heard, and the other said that he had not heard, and having reached the place were only to Joshua. The one who claimed that there was nothing, lighting the place with a torch, said that as he said there was nothing here. The other one said it was strange, because he heard something. And the other one said he should get some sleep, but now they need to go on shift. Running through the alleys, Joshua thought that there was a chance that Rugia would help him cope with the problem, if he can take control of all three forces. At this time, a heart-rending scream was heard inside the house in the stable. Inside the house, Lucy, a blue-haired girl, was grabbed by Lloyd, Rolls, and Groth. Lucy screamed and asked why they were doing this, and Groth, drawing his sword, shouted that what she didn't understand was that they were mixed up with shit because of his son. Lucy bit Lloyd's hand and he screamed and threw her away. The girl fell, hitting her head on the floor, and Lloyd came up to her again and grabbed her by the hair and shouted that he only wanted to have fun, but Lucy leaves him no choice. Meanwhile, Groth was approaching her with a drawn sword and telling Lloyd to hold him tighter. Groth was stopped by Rolls, asking if he was sure. If Joshua finds out, Grotto discarded a friend, asked, well, so what? Rolls, have you forgotten why they're here? They came to get rid of this sucker's mom. Rolls, however, did not back down and asked him to stop, but the Grotto in a rage shouted that the Duchess had said that everything would be settled. If Rolls chickened out, then let him get out of here. Lloyd, grinning, also told Rolls to get out if he was scared, and meanwhile, Groth's sword was approaching Lucy's neck. Suddenly there was a shout telling them to stop, and everyone turned around and saw Joshua at the door. Groth laughed, saying they were waiting for him, and Lloyd said that if he had come a little later, he would have seen a red picture. Rolls was in a panic and told his friends not to provoke Joshua, because he was not the one they took him for. Joshua, on the other hand, stood in a rage, clenching his fists and looking at these thugs. He promised that these three would not leave here alive. Lucy, barely opening her eyes, said the guy's name. Rolls, trembling with fear, said that they should run because the guy would kill them. Groth shouted at his friend, calling him a rag, and got up from his seat. Lloyd brandished his sword and headed towards the guy, shouting that he would send the guy to the next world. The Grotto, however, shouted that they would leave it for him. Joshua, not paying attention to these three, shouted for the one who was hiding to come out. Lloyd said that the guy was completely stunned, that he even thought of himself. But before Lloyd could finish, a body came down from the roof, asking how the guy found out about him. The person who came down from the roof was a young guy with yellow hair. When he came down, he asked how Joshua found out about him, and those three in surprise shouted the guy's name, Knight Kane. Seeing him, Joshua decided that this guy was following him. It looks like he was ordered by Chiffon. Three soldiers immediately put their fists to their hearts and greeted him, but Kane ignored them and approached the guy. Kane, looking at the guy, thought there were rumors about him. Joshua told him he had a question. With a grim face, Joshua told Kane that the soldiers were eating would harm the Duke's woman and what was the statutory punishment for this crime. Hearing this, Kane was shocked and even turned pale, and feeling the pressure, Kane clenched his fist and said that the liquidation was in place. Before Lloyd could raise his sword, Kane was already standing in front of him and cut his side, and followed him to the grotto. He, shouting that it was not necessary, swung his sword, but Kane easily suppressed the block and then took off his head and followed him with a jerk. He went towards Rolls, who begged with raised hands to be forgiven. But Kane was impassive and almost blew this one's head off. But Joshua shouted at him to stop and Kane stopped his blade at the very last moment. Rolls begged with tears in his eyes not to be killed and Kane told Tom to shut up if he wanted to live. Joshua told Kane to stop, but he replied that he was tired of clearly saying that they should die for attacking the Duke's woman. The Scarlet Knights are one of the 3 knightly orders of the Duke, but they are considered the weakest of them, considering that this guy was ordered to keep an eye on Joshua. Then most likely Kane is still a beginner. At this time, 2 half-dead men trembling on the floor said that they were in pain. Kane took down 2 opponents in just a couple of moves, which means from the point of view of skills he is somewhere in the upper part of Class B. Joshua turned to the knight, asking if his name was Kane and the guy nodded. Then Joshua asked before he executed them. Joshua would like to know who is the knight's master. After a couple of seconds, Kane looked at the guy and said that it was Duke Agnos. Then Joshua pointed to himself and asked, then who is Joshua for him? Those eyes, full of determination, reminded Kane of him. Joshua ordered the sword to be put away, and Kane obeyed and put the sword in the scabbard. Rolls immediately fell to his knees and bumped his forehead on the floor, shouted that he was grateful to his lordship and he would do whatever he said. He is also grateful that he was given life. In a rage, Joshua, clasping his hands, shouted that he did not need the gratitude of such scum, and he did not leave alive those who tried to harm him or his people. But Rolls is a savvy guy, and he probably already understood everything. All soldiers, without exception, should know about what happened today. Everyone should know that if anyone else does something like this, he, Joshua, will personally take his life. If Rolls understands everything, then let him fail. Rolls, almost crying, got up and said that he obeyed and ran away from home. Then Joshua saw his mother lying unconscious on the ground and was about to approach when Kane asked him if he was the son of the Duke he knew. Annoyed, Joshua told him not to talk nonsense. Kane said Joshua had changed too much. The gentleman he remembered, the dumb son of the owner, the cleaner of horse shit. Smiling, Joshua continued for Kane looking at him. Kane froze and clenched his fist, told the guy that all the knights of the House of Agnos obey the orders of the Duke and when a knight turns 23, he is free to choose his own master. Kane would be 23 next year, and he wanted to trust his gut. Putting his fist to his heart and bowing his head, he said that he would be watching him all this year. If you look at things rationally, it would be safer for Kane to follow the Duke's treasure, Pavel Agnos. Smiling, Joshua said that Kane was weird. At this time, the guy heard his mother's voice and turned around and saw her looking at him with tears in her eyes and saying that he was whole. Joshua quickly jumped into his mother's arms and, crying, told her that now he would protect her. In his previous life, Joshua's youth was full of regrets. But now, there is a chance to fix everything. This time everything will be different, because he is no longer a boy from the stable of Joshua Agnos, but the greatest lancer in the history of the continent, Joshua Sanders. In the mansion of Agnos, in one of the many corridors, the Duke and Chiffin were walking. The Duke asked Chiffin that Count Rugia had come to them. Chiffin nodded and said that he had escorted him to the reception area. But this time the Count was not alone. Surprised by this, the Duke turned around, waiting for further words, and Chiffin did not disappoint, said that Miss Islin had arrived with him. Exhaling, the Duke said that it meant the Count had decided to sort everything out. Count Fonsel Zen Rugia, a handsome, young man with a calm character, dark purple hair and already lighter purple eyes. He had a habit of wearing a tuxedo, as well as glasses. He was an unexpected and unpleasant guest. Although he had a title lower than that of a duke, but his influence on the empire could not be underestimated. The daughter of the Count, Islin Zen Rugia, was a beautiful girl with blue hair the color of the sky and violet eyes the color of violets. Like Pavel, she was considered a genius in the empire. Islin reached the 2nd grade in magic at the age of 9. When children were born without mana, they were called cursed with mana, but those who are gifted with sensitivity to mana from birth are called blessed with mana. Islin was just such a child. She could sense mana even without special training. Some magicians even call it a divine treasure. The Count came with his daughter, and that can only mean one thing. The Duke sighed and said that Fonsel would bother him all day today. In response, Chiffin said that Mr. Pavel was 15 next year, and 3 years remained until he came of age. He has something to think about. The Duke frowned and said that Pavel, but without finishing his speech, he just shook his head. Chiffin, seeing this, said that there was still Mrs. Charla. Charla de Fonte was the daughter of the Duc de Fonte. She was a beauty with red hair like a wild rose. Charla, as usual, wore bright dresses, which made her even more beautiful. The Duke sighed and asked what he should do now. The 5 dukes of the empire are very influential. Madame Charla is the daughter of the House of Fonte, who received the title due to wealth. Chiffin said that he thought that Mrs. Charla from the House of Fonte would be the perfect match for the young gentleman. The Duke only said he was sorry. Chiffin, looking at the Duke's smooth back, thought to himself that Mr. Agnos was always looking for outstanding people. The Duke was one of those people who judged people only by their abilities. Suddenly the Duke stopped and Chiffin asked what was the matter. The Duke asked Chiffin what about Joshua. Surprised, Chiffin asked what the Duke was talking about, and he smiled maliciously and said he would give Island to Joshua. Chiffin in shock said that the one that is blessed with mana gives to the child that is cursed by mana. Before the revival, Joshua's mother was buried on a rock north of the Duke's garden. He often went up there to visit her grave. And now he was doing the same thing, but for a different reason, climbing the rocky ledges with difficulty. He finally reached the top and, sighing with fatigue, whined that it had not been so difficult for him in his previous life. In a previous life, one day, while he was visiting his mother, he accidentally opened the entrance to a secret place. But now he knew how to open the door to this place. Finding the right piece of land, Joshua bit his finger and spilled a drop of blood. In his previous life, he found Rugia behind the portal, and now he intended to do the same. Blood spread on the ground, and a magic circle with 3 or 4 pentagrams superimposed on each other flashed around him. After some time, a round gate opened right in front of the guy, sparkling with blue lightning and shrouded in something similar to clouds. Joshua took a step inside and came out already at the ruins of some place, which was amazing, but it seemed like these ruins were floating in the sky. In the center of the ruins towered a structure somewhat similar to a temple with 4 columns, on top of which there was a red color. Joshua, walking towards the temple, looked around at the ruins, thinking to himself why everything is so destroyed here. He even had thoughts that this was not the same temple, because in his previous life when he found this place, it was not in such a mess. It was a kilometer or a kilometer and a half to the entrance to the temple itself, and the whole way to the goal was in cracks, and in some places there were holes from which light shone. Because of this, it seemed that the ruins were floating in the sky. Entering the main entrance, he also remembered that Riguar was standing in chains in the center of the temple on this altar, in which some kind of stick was now lying. Approaching him, he thought about what kind of iron stick it was. When he touched the polka, the radiant white light blinded him, and when everything passed and he opened his eyes, he looked around in surprise. There was nothing around him, just a white void. Shouting, "Where is he and what is this place?" He heard the answer, and surprised by this, he turned around and saw a stick floating in the sky shrouded in a black aura. Jumping away from the stick, he asked who he was, and looking closely, he recognized in this stick the same iron stick that lay on the altar of the temple. The stick said that it was not an iron stick, but a Rugia, a demonic weapon. Joshua, hearing about the demonic, asked in surprise what it meant, because he did not know about it. In his previous life, Rugia was his loyal battle companion. Joshua could not believe that he had been a demonic weapon all this time. And in general, the guy was worried about his current appearance, Rugia, because he looked like an ordinary stick. Joshua privately assumed that Rugia looked like this because he, too, had returned to the past. Rugia himself said that they don't have time, because right now there are 2 different forces inside the guy. The confrontation of magic and divine energy, and it is deadly. There is only one way to put them to sleep and awaken the hidden power that lies dormant inside Joshua. Joshua needs to regain his former power as soon as possible. Now he is able to reach the 4th level of spear mastery, possession of the spear, which Joshua learned in a previous life. It allowed the use of mana in combination with the art of the spear, which carried a truly destructive potential. Ignorant's strongest weapon was considered to be the sword, and in the past many people laughed at him who chose the path of the spear. After all, for them, the art of wielding a spear was just bad fun. But in a previous life, those who could fight with him on equal terms could be counted on the fingers of one hand, and everyone who laughed at his art paid for it with severe injuries. In his previous life, he had reached the 5th level of spear mastery, and this could be considered comparable to the class of swordsman knights, the so-called absolute masters. With only the 5th level of spear mastery out of 8, he was already considered the strongest knight on the continent, and the 4th level, which Rugia promised, was approximately equal to the highest category of B class. Joshua was confident that he could rise to this level again, because he had already been to this level once, but they didn't have much time. Clenching his fist, he remembered the injuries when he started controlling mana. In his current state, it was extremely difficult for him to do this. He winced at the realization of this fact, but Rugia calmed him down, saying that as long as Rugia is around, the guy will be able to rise to the right level using mana without side effects. Joshua enthusiastically asked again if this was true, and Rugia, without answering the question, told him to improve his skills. When he climbs to the top again, Rugia will be able to regain his power. Rugia promised Joshua that the latter would be able to accomplish all his plans, and then the floating stick began to disappear. Seeing this, Joshua hurriedly wanted to stop his comrade in arms, but he finally only threw it so that Joshua started training. With a new bright flash that almost blinded the guy, Joshua found himself on the ruins of the temple, and in his hand he had an iron stick, which turned out to be a Rugia. Looking around, and then looking at the stick again, he clenched his teeth thinking about his friend. Joshua swung his stick, remembering Rugia's words that he could use mana without consequences. Closing his eyes, the guy began to concentrate on the mana technique that only he knew. At first, it was necessary to absorb particles from the surrounding space, and this was the 1st level. Opening his eyes, Joshua was convinced that he had succeeded, because blue mana was raging around him. Then the guy pushed his leg back, taking a first-level stance and started over. The first level. The concentration of money at one point in an explosive lunge that was like a shot. The aura from the spear shot towards the wall like a bullet and crashed into the last one, leaving a small crater on it. Smiling, he said to himself that this is just the beginning. As soon as he regains all his strength, he will take away everything that Kaiser Ben Britain has. A room for receiving guests. There was a piano in the corner next to the window, and several round tables were covered with a tablecloth in the hall. And above the tablecloth there were delicious dishes. There were 4 tables in the hall, and 2 of them were occupied. On one sat a red-haired girl with a large man, and on the other a blue-haired girl with a more refined and elegant man. A servant with light brown hair and a rounded mustache coughed, thereby attracting the attention of the guests, and announced that His Grace, the Duke, had arrived. The Duke, in his usual aristocratic clothes, came in with Chiffon, who was wearing a uniform attached to a knight of the Duke's family. Smiling, the Duke said that unexpected guests had arrived here. A beautiful girl of about 11 with scarlet hair, and a cute pink dress that emphasized the innocence, but at the same time the grace of the hostess. Charla de Fonte, daughter of the House of Fonte, curtsied and greeted the Duke. The Duke asked what she was doing here at such a time. And then a man with a thick beard, a square head and short dark brown hair and a broad forehead, smiling, bowed and said that Lady Charlotte insisted that they visit His Grace, the Duke, and for such self-will, Cox, a loyal servant of the House of Fonte, asked for forgiveness. The Duke nodded to him and said that he had nothing to apologize for, because even when they were both in the capital, it would not always be possible to meet, so everything turned out well. Cox was a loyal vassal and one of the key figures of the House of Fonte. Not a single financial transaction passed him by. Smiling and rubbing his hands, he said that he was pleased to hear the Duke's words. The Duke, smiling, said that if Cox feels guilty, then maybe he will invest a little in the House of Agnos. At this time, a little lady intervened, saying that his lordship was such a rude person. After all, they haven't seen each other for a long time, and he immediately hunts for their riches. Smiling, the Duke said that only now he recognizes Charla. After all, by her greeting, at first he did not even understand if it was the same Charla he had known before. Smiling, Charla said that she had heard that Pavel had already reached C-class. She was also thinking about attracting talented people to her side. The nervous Cox shouted for her mistress to stop immediately and immediately bowed to the Duke, asking for his forgiveness and saying that his mistress was still young and tactless. The Duke said that there was nothing wrong with that, because the girl behaved at her age, and then the Duke turned and noticed the Count. With a slightly pale face, he apologized to Count Fonsalz and Rivrec and said that he had not noticed him. The Count was a handsome man in a light brown coat, under which was a dark brown jacket, and under it was a white apron with a green tailcoat. He was wearing round glasses, under which his wise and calm light purple eyes shone. His dark purple hair was neatly arranged in both directions. Standing next to him was his daughter, Islin Zenrivreka, a beautiful girl with blue hair and a black dress with a shade of green. She was almost the same age as Charla. Making a curtsy to Islin, she greeted the Duke. At this time, Charla exclaimed that the girl had forgotten it here. Cox quietly asked her not to do that, but Charla didn't even listen to him. Charla, smiling radiantly, asked about what she had recently heard, a rumor saying that one of the Duke's sons had beaten 3 soldiers. Cox nervously shouted for his lady to follow the words. Charla puffed out her cheeks and asked what was the matter, because she was interested. Cox also said that there is no confirmation of these rumors, and therefore, but Chiffon did not let him finish, interrupting him, saying that it was just a rumor, which surprised both Charla and Cox. Chiffon continued, saying that Mr. Joshua is too small, and moreover cursed by Mana. How would he be able to cope with 3 adult soldiers? Count Rivreka, who was standing aside listening to this conversation in surprise, asked if it was true that he was cursed by Mana. The Duke, looking at the Count, asked if he would look at his son, because he is one of the few 5th-class magicians in the Empire, and this means that the Count feels Mana better than the Duke himself. The Duke would like the Count to take a look at Joshua. The Count, smiling, thought to himself that this was a chance to prove himself in front of the Duke and therefore agreed. At this time, Chiffon asked the Duke if he needed to make sure of Mr. Joshua's condition first. The Duke, looking at him, asked what he was talking about, and Chiffon replied that before the Duke left for the capital, he should fully make sure that Mr. Joshua was cursed with Mana. This is to dispel the rumors. The Duke frowned and asked what his knight was up to, and Chiffon replied that if the Duke would allow it, he would like to arrange a sparring match between Joshua and one of his subordinates. The Duke doubtfully asked about what Chiffon wanted to arrange, a duel between a Scarlet Knight and a 9-year-old child. But Chiffon, without backing down, said that if the rumors are true, this is a great way to check everything. The knight had just the right candidate for this role. Smiling maliciously, Chiffon said that the Duke would be pleased. The next day, Knight Kane stood saluting in the reception area of Chiffon. Chiffon told him that he had received a report and asked the knight if there had been a skirmish with the soldiers. Kane, standing straight, said that everything was like that. Chiffon, frowning, said that it was his right to liquidate them on the spot in accordance with the charter, But wasn't this decision hasty? Kane, still standing, said that those soldiers wanted to harm the Duke's woman. Hearing this, Chiffon slapped the table in anger and got up from his seat and asked if it was true. How dare they attack Mistress Vanessa? When Kane heard this, he said that he was not looking at Mrs. Vanessa, but at Mrs. Lucy. Hearing Kane's words, Chiffon calmed down and sat back down, said that Mrs. Lucy was the one who. Kane nodded, said that this was the Duke's other chosen one. Disappointed in the answer, Chiffon leaned back on the table and asked if Kane had dealt with their own people for the sake of some maid. Kane also said that Lady Lucy is the one chosen by His Grace the Duke, and an attack on her is not permissible for any soldier and officer. Their actions defiled the Duke's honor. If Kane was wrong, then he was ready to be punished. Chiffon thought for a while and waved it off, said that they would not talk about it anymore and that Kane had a new task. Kane said he was waiting for an order. Chiffon made a serious face and told the knight that he would fight Joshua today. Surprised, Kane asked in disbelief that he would fight with Mr. Joshua. Chiffon nodded and said that Kane had heard correctly. This duel would determine whether Joshua was cursed by Mana. Chiffon himself was completely sure of this, but his lordship didn't seem to think so. If everything is left like this, it will cause problems for Mr. Pavel in the future. Kane asked if Chiffon thought that Mr. Joshua could displace Mr. Pavel. Hearing this, Chiffon slammed his fist on the table and shouted that Kane was not talking nonsense. Mr. Pavel was a genius not to be found on the whole continent. Some kind of dust on the soul will not be able to prevent him. When Kane heard that Joshua was called dust, he only grinned, remembering the terrible sight of a 9-year-old boy. He looked more like a meteor crashing into the firmament. Chiffon, interrupting Kane's thoughts, said that during the duel, his task is to share a small amount of mana. The bodies of those cursed with mana begin to reject it. It is a deadly poison. If Joshua is cursed by mana, he won't last a year. Hearing about this, Kane tensed up. He knew that Chiffon faithfully served Mr. Pavel, but to say such things so openly. Chiffon, not thinking about the thoughts of his subordinate, told him to go to the training ground, and he would soon bring the Duke and his guests. Kane bowed and said he was listening. On the training ground, there was a row of training swords on the stand, and Kane took one, thinking that although there was an order from a higher officer, he told Mr. Joshua that he would be watching him and Kane was not going to harm him. At this time, Joshua himself appeared on the set and confirmed with Kane that his name was Kane. Right. Kane just said hello, and Joshua asked if they would have sparring. Kane said the sparring was meant to test the master's abilities, as he understood it was the Duke's will. Joshua smiled, clenching his fist. It seems the Duke saw strength in him after all. He won't disappoint him. Kane put the sword back in the stand and told Joshua that he didn't have to worry. Kane wasn't going to fight at full strength. Grinning, Joshua said it was ridiculous to underestimate him. Surprised by the reaction, Kane said he wasn't underestimating. But Joshua, not listening to him, said that although Kane was allowed to choose his master, he should not forget that Joshua was also free to choose his subordinates, and it was not in his plans to trust the back of an arrogant idiot. If Kane wants to see his strength, then let him give his all. Isn't that what he's wearing a sword for? At this time, a number of people appeared behind Joshua, and the Duke, who was in front of everyone, asked these two if they had time to get acquainted. Kane bowed and greeted the Duke, but Joshua did not move. Seeing this, Chiffon thought to himself that, as he expected, this guy has no manners. But suddenly, Joshua knelt down on one knee and also greeted the Duke. The Duke, pleased with this, not like the angry Chiffon, said that he did not remember anyone teaching Joshua manners, but he was doing well. Joshua, smiling, said that he was just observant. The Duke asked if the guy had heard everything, and Joshua said that he had heard that the Duke wanted to test his skills. Chiffon took a step forward and said that Mr. Joshua was mistaken. This was not a test, but a gesture of the Duke's goodwill. They just want to check if he's cursed with mana and then cure him. Listening to all this, Joshua frowned, thinking that he seemed to have forgotten that Chiffon, a supporter of Paul. Apparently, Chiffon came up with all this to kill him. The Duke asked if they were ready, and Kane said that they would proceed on the Duke's orders. But the Duke, smiling, said that there had been a misunderstanding. Joshua's opponent would not be Kane, but Pavel. Pavel, coming out of the crowd, grinned, saying that he would help his younger brother, because who would take care of him if not his older brother? His blue eyes shone in the rays coming out of the windows, and his confident gait said everything for the owner. Pavel was wearing a gray shirt, and under it a dark gray jacket, and a purple tailcoat decorated his neck. The guy had a sword on his belt, and his trousers were white. The Duke, looking down at the two sons, said that this was just a practice match, so they should only use wooden swords. Pavel, taking a wooden sword from the stand, brought it to Joshua for training, saying that of course he would use a training sword because he was not going to fight at full strength. Joshua, smiling, thought that Chiffon and Pavel had staged a whole show here in order to finish him off, so he had to show them what a real show was. Grinning devilishly, Joshua also went to the stand, but unlike his brother, he took a mop and broke its end, making a simple stick out of it. These actions of his certainly surprised Duke and Chiffon, but Joshua didn't care. He raised his stick and proudly said that this would be enough for him. Charla, the red-haired Fonty, seeing this, laughed, saying that the guy was funny, and the eternally nervous Coke told her not to talk like that. Chiffon, taking a step, said that it was not a joke that Joshua was going to do with just a stick. But the Duke stopped him with his hand and asked the boy, who turned to the voice, that he seriously intended to fight with this. Of course, Joshua said that he was more serious than ever, seeing the confidence in his son's eyes. The Duke nodded and looked at Chiffon and the guests, told them to sit down and get ready to watch the duel. After Chiffon bowed and began to lead the guests, the Duke turned towards Pavel and warned him not to use mana. The smug Pavel, who had already assumed a pose, said that the Duke should not worry, but thought to himself that it was a pity to waste mana on this renegade. Kane was also among the observers, and the fact that his future master took a stick did not make him very happy, but on the contrary, made him nervous. He wondered what his master was up to. Grinning, Pavel mockingly told Joshua that in vain he thought to repel him by hitting him with some kind of stick, although it was Joshua's stick. Smiling nastily, Pavel continued, saying that the stick is very similar to the mop with which Joshua kneaded shit in the stable. Joshua, without commenting on his brother's words in any way, just assumed a pose with a stick, as if he had a spear in his hands. The Duke shouted for them to start the duel, and Pavel immediately went towards Joshua with a jerk. But when he raised his head, the end of the stick was waiting for him. At the last moment, Pavel managed to turn away from the blow with the stick, and without getting lost, he immediately prepared to make a horizontal swing with the sword, at the same time provoking Joshua. Because if he learned to hold a stick somewhere, it does not mean that it will work. Joshua, watching his brother's movement, thought to himself that Pavel was B-class, and although he was fast, he was very predictable. Before Pavel managed to make a swing from the left side, Joshua managed to hit him from the right side in the side, but Led again at the last moment managed to put a block with his hand. But of course his loss in the first round angered Pavel, and he angrily raised his sword, shouting that Joshua was a plebeian nobody and he would not be able to defeat him. But again, I got a shelf in my stomach without having time to make a swing. Pavel grabbed a stick by his stomach with one hand, trembling all over and saying that he could not lose to such trash as Joshua. Joshua, seeing his brother's persistence, thought to himself that he was holding up well, in that case he would keep his distance. But his thoughts were interrupted when he saw how Pavel's wooden sword glowed blue and was rapidly approaching the guy. Seeing this, the Duke immediately thought that mana at such a distance was very dangerous and shouted for Pavel to stop, but there was already an explosion from the collision of the mana of both participants. Due to the explosion, dust and blinding light rose. But when they subsided, the Duke saw that Pavel's sword had broken off, but Joshua's stick was swirling with a fading dense, dark blue mana. Count Rugia, who was watching like the others, exclaimed in surprise that it was mana. Surprised, Pavel, with a destroyed sword, clenched his teeth and looked at Joshua and could not believe that this pitiful creature had mana. Pavel remembered his father's words that he would return next year and wait for the results from Joshua. And not believing that his brother could take his place in a rage, he threw away the wooden broken sword and pulling out his sword, filled it with mana, shouting that he was not the rightful heir of the duchy. Joshua, looking at this, thought with tension that even though the duchy would fall in 10 years, but it could become, for him, Joshua, solid ground under his feet and help him achieve his goals in the future. As a poet, he filled a stick with his thick mana with the idea that he should devour Paul. The two mana-filled weapons were on their way to clash, but a shout filled with the Duke's power and aura stopped them both. Not only Joshua and Pavel, but also Charla, covered her ears from unbearable pain. The Duke, with a gloomy face, said that if these two continued, he would not spare them. Of course, the sons heeded the will of their father. Chiffon, in turn, trembled with indignation and irritation. Gritting his teeth, he couldn't believe Joshua had mana at 9 years old. This is the first time in history to happen in the world. The Duke turned to Chiffon and asked if this duel was enough. When he came to, Chiffon said that he had never seen such a mana, but at the same time Count Rugia said that he thought it was mana. The Count looked down doubtfully and said that although Mr. Joshua had less mana than Mr. Pavel, its structure was strikingly different from everything the Count had seen. What was particularly remarkable was the way she concentrated. Charla was surprised to say that it looks like Joshua really owns mana, but Kane was surprised by the strength of his future master. Smiling, the Duke praised Joshua for having mana at the age of 9. This surprised the Duke, and he did not pay attention at all to the angry Pavel, who was standing at a distance. Chiffon wanted to object again, but the Duke, with an overwhelming aura, ordered him to calm down. Sweating, Chiffon bowed his head and said that he was obeying his lordship. The Duke then turned to Joshua, saying that he was waiting for him in his chambers that evening. This, of course, surprised Chiffon and Pavel very much. Especially Pavel was very angry, because his father never let him into his chambers. Joshua, seeing his brother's attempts, clenched his fist and smiled and said that he would be glad to meet the Duke. In the guest room of the Duke's mansion, Charla was now there, smiling and jumping on the bed, telling Cox that it was cool. The nervous Coke calmed his mistress as best he could, but the girl was incredibly happy. She clenched her fists with joy and said that it was amazing that Joshua owned mana at his age. It could even be considered a historical moment. Then, clapping her hands, she said that she had made up her mind. Surprised, Cox asked her what she had decided on, and she said that of course she was a little embarrassed that Joshua was an illegitimate child, but she would still make him her own. In the Duke's residence, in the Duchess's room, the Duchess in anger slapped Chiffon, who was sitting on one knee. Duchess Vanessa von Agnos was the sister of the Emperor and the wife of Duke Agnos. She, like Pavel, had golden hair and blue eyes, and now she was angry. After the slap, she asked Chiffon again what happened to Pavel. Chiffon, looking at the floor, said that Mr. Pavel had lost to Joshua, because of which the Duchess's anger rose to heaven again, and the Duchess, unable to stand it, gave another slap to Chiffon. Trembling with anger, the Duchess did not believe what Chiffon said. How could this little bastard use mana and even beat Pavel? How is this even possible? Somehow restraining herself, the Duchess folded her arms on her chest and looked at Chiffon, asked what the Duke had said. Chiffon, not daring to raise his head, reported that the Duke would most likely take the guy to the capital. Chiffon thought that after the Duke personally saw the guy's abilities, he personally wanted to observe his growth. Therefore, Chiffon thought that it could not be left like this, because problems could begin. The Duchess, in response, told him that if he had done his job better, then this would not have happened at all. Chiffon asked Ms. Vanessa not to worry, because he knew how to fix the situation. Vanessa looked at him expectantly, and Chiffon said that although it was just his guess, he thought that the Duke wanted to announce to the whole empire that Joshua's mana had reached B rank. The Duchess snorted at his guesses and told him to stop talking nonsense. But Chiffon did not want to give up and reported that 2 counts were also watching the duel. Even if they assume that they didn't see mana in that fight, then Joshua will definitely be tested. The Duchess asked curiously what kind of test it was, and the knight replied that in their empire, in order to be recognized as a B-class knight, he must fight a knight from the order of the imperial family. And of course there is also to demonstrate mana. Hearing this, the Duchess was delighted, not believing in such luck. After all, her uncles were connected with the knightly order of the monastic family, and it looks like she will have to contact him. Meanwhile, evening came and Joshua knocked on the Duke's door, at the same time saying that it was him. From the other side of the door, a voice was heard telling him to come in, and he opened the door and went in and saw the Duke standing near his desk. Joshua dropped to one knee and greeted his father. The Duke, coldly looking at him, said to introduce himself. Joshua hesitated for a second, but then he raised his head and said that he was Joshua von Agnos. The Duke, seeing this confidence of his son, said that he had changed a lot during the time they had not seen each other. Joshua just said it's been a long time. Then the Duke closed his eyes and asked the guy if he hated him. Joshua, denying it, said that the Duke had important business in the imperial palace, so he did not count on much. But still, the guy had a request to the Duke. The Duke asked him what his request was, but without giving him an answer, he himself asked if he wanted an apology. Joshua immediately rejected it, and thought to himself that apologies in the cruel world of natural selection are worthless, and he said out loud that the request was related to their train to the capital. The Duke, looking at him condescendingly, asked if he thought the Duke would take him. Joshua answered yes without a second's hesitation, and the Duke asked why he thought so. The first reason was that, before the appearance of Joshua, Pavel was considered the undisputed heir of the Duke, but after what happened, it is necessary to prevent unrest in the family, and therefore it is better not to leave him here. Smiling contentedly, the Duke thought that his son was not only fighting well. If he had known about it earlier, he would have adopted him. Joshua continued, saying that the second reason is the greed of the Duke himself and the latter's unwillingness to let the guy go. After all, if he can climb to the top and surpass the Duke, then the Duchy of Agnos can soar on everyone. So soar that he won't even have to reckon with the imperial family. The Duke said with displeasure that Joshua's words sounded as if he had all the data for this. Joshua, on the other hand, said that he at least has the strength that will not disappoint the Duke. The Duke was extremely pleased and considered Joshua a masterpiece. The guy stood in front of him and wasn't a bit afraid. The Duke asked Joshua if he had any idea what the Duke would do with him. Joshua, standing straight, said that he would be sent to the academy, which is located in the capital. In the Avalon Empire, the children of aristocrats must study at the academy from the age of 10 to 16. Students with outstanding talent may graduate earlier. The imperial family created this system in order to keep the children in the academy as hostages and thereby control the aristocrats while maintaining their loyalty to the imperial family. And if outstanding talents appear, then attract them to your side. The Duke said that Joshua was right. He would take the guy to the capital. So they will be around and he, the Duke, can teach him. There are only 5 masters in the empire, including Agnos, and it's an incredible chance to get from him, but Joshua still refused. Not understanding the reason for the refusal, the Duke asked why, and Joshua replied that even though the Duke is a real master of the sword, but Joshua himself wants to use a spear. Hearing his son's words, the Duke immediately became enraged, thinking to himself that in sparring it looks like the guy did not just use a pathetic stick, emitting a huge amount of money directed towards Joshua. He said that he did not understand the guy. Why did he want to use a spear? Feeling the pressure of this rough but very strong mana, Joshua could hardly stand, thinking to himself that the Duke was devoted to the sword, but he was boundlessly loyal to the spear. Joshua, looking firmly in the Duke's direction, said that he would sweep away with his spear anyone who stood in his way, even if it was the Duke himself, who is one of the 9 stars. Upon hearing this, the frowning Duke said that since he had so much honor, he should show what his spear was worth. Joshua, incredulous, asked what he meant by sparring with the Duke himself, and the Duke nodded, saying that he would check it out himself. Smiling, Joshua thought to himself that Agnos is one of the 9 stars. There will be no such chance anymore. The Duke asked him if he agreed, and Joshua replied that he agreed, but with one condition. If Joshua passes the test, then the Duke must agree to his request. Smiling, the Duke agreed to this condition and added his own. If Joshua does not pass, then he will obey his orders. After hearing this, the guy immediately realized that his father, in case of victory, wanted to force him to change his spear for a sword, but still agreed because he was not going to hide his skills. At this time, somewhere and at someone conjured over the ball until a face appeared there. Next to the magician, the woman took off her hood and Duchess Agnos was already looking into the ball after greeting her uncle. There was a man with blonde hair and a light beard in the ball, and he greeted the Duchess in the same way, asking about her well-being and about the Duke. The Duchess, she said that the Duke seemed to have things to do, but she had a request for her uncle. Joshua left the Duke's room and looked back in his direction once more, thinking about the power that the Duke had shown. That's the power of the master. The guy's body was still shaking. While he was thinking about his own, Pavel suddenly called him, who was standing to his left. Turning around, he looked at Pavel, who said that they needed to talk. Joshua immediately turned around, saying that he had nothing to talk about with him, but Pavel shouted at him to freeze in place. In anger and rage, Pavel shouted at him to fight again. Joshua looked at his brother's clear gaze, despite his anger and rage, and said to himself that Pavel's gaze had changed. Now he was burning with passion and a desire to never lose. He had a desire to win. Smiling, Joshua asked Pavel if he was sure for his words. At this time, in the majestic imperial palace, a man with golden hair combed back and a beard of the same color sat on the throne. He was laughing loudly after the words of the man with green hair who was bowing to him. He asked if it was right. It is true that Agnos' family has a child again who can become a star. This man with golden eyes and royal black outfits was the emperor himself, Marcus Ben Britain. A man with green hair and the same eye color said that it was. The emperor asked him that Vanessa was hiding this child, but the man, who seemed to be a knight, said that the child was not Vanessa's son. Surprised, the emperor asked if the boy was a bastard, and the knight said that he was the servant's son. Finding this interesting, the emperor got up from his seat, walking back and forth. From the boiling blood, he said that even Pavel is a real treasure for the empire, and now another such genius has appeared, and both of them were from the Agnos family. The emperor even envied Duke Agnos. The green-haired knight said that the princes were geniuses too, but the emperor denied it. Yes, some were able to inherit his strength, but they are still too weak. Although the emperor underestimated the abilities of the princes, but they were really talented. The emperor himself has enough power to be a master, and because of this underestimates others. For the same reason, the emperor was eagerly looking for talents. Stroking his beard, the emperor said that since the duke had stopped hiding his second son, it meant that his strength was at least comparable to that of Paul. The green-haired one said that there are rumors that Pavel lost to this guy. The emperor, surprised, asked how Paul could lose, the older guy. Bowing his head, the green-haired man said that the boy was 9. A 9-year-old boy brought the main genius of the empire to his knees. After thinking about it, the emperor laughed loudly, saying that it was very, very interesting. The green-haired one also reported that Duke Agnos was most likely to request a sparring match with a knight from the imperial order, and roughly speaking, the green-haired one believed that this guy was almost at the C-class level. Smiling, the emperor rejoiced at his find. After all, at just 9 years old, he did such a thing. It intrigued him very much. Hearing his words, the green-haired man doubtfully thought that it looked like the emperor himself wanted to make sure of the strength of this boy. The emperor was an empire and the consequences of his actions were devastating. He asked the emperor himself about it, but he only sighed in frustration, saying that he would like to, but the wolves are just waiting for the right moment, so, unfortunately, he will not succeed. But still, the emperor ordered to send one of the princes, because to understand talents is one of the qualities that an emperor should possess. When the table is set, everyone should have time to eat as much as they can. At that time, Joshua and Pavel's fight started, and Joshua jumped with concentrated mana in his fists towards Pavel. The latter took out his sword and put a block, but recoiled back from the recoil of the blow, and his hand was cut on the tip of his own sword. Pavel couldn't believe the mana in his bare fist had such power. Joshua, getting up, said that Pavlov's face showed what he was thinking. Joshua forced Paul to see how strong hand-to-hand combat, which Paul so disrespected, could be. Startled, Pavel shouted to Joshua not to mock him. After filling his sword with mana, he swung his sword towards Joshua, and Joshua again filled his hands with a thick dark blue aura hit the blade, shouting aura explosion. The explosion threw Pavel far away. Pavel wondered how Joshua was able to transfer mana to one point. He didn't want to admit it, but he couldn't help but admit that Joshua was much stronger than him. A shadow covered him, and he heard a voice asking him if he was offended. Pavel, trembling, shouted his brother's name, and Joshua himself, looking at him coldly, told him to become stronger. But I did not forget this feeling of defeat. Pavel lost to an unarmed man whom he underestimated. Joshua wanted to tear Paul to pieces because he insulted him and his mother, but he spared him for the pure love of rivalry. But Joshua promised that if Paul did not correct his behavior, he would make sure that Paul could not use his hands. Trembling all over, Pavel looked at the mad face of his brother. When leaving, Joshua told him not to forget about their difference in strength, and these were the last words that cut into the pride of the young guy and made him shed tears. The next day in the Duchy of Agnos, in Joshua's room, the guy suffered from using too much mana. Although it became easier to control mana due to the fact that he absorbed Rugia, but the residual pain did not go away. Clenching his puny fist, he thought it was because his body wasn't trained yet. Suddenly there was a knock on his white door, and the guy thought that Cain had come. But when he opened the door, he saw a red-haired girl who immediately asked the guy that he was Joshua von Agnos. The guy, without answering, asked in reply who she was, and a beautiful girl with red hair and beautiful eyes of the same color said that her name was Charla de Fonte. She asked if he would mind if she addressed him as you, yet he was 3 years younger than her. Coming into the room, Charlie said that Joshua could call her sister. The guy himself is dissatisfied and frowned. But even without seeing it, the girl continued, asking him to chat not on the threshold, because she has a lot of questions. But Joshua did not let Charlie go into the room and blocked her way with his hand, which surprised the girl very much, and then he whispered in her ear to get out and slammed the door in front of her. Then it completely shocked her, talking about some kind of game happening. Early in the morning, Joshua was walking to his bed when there was another knock on the door. Turning angrily, he opened the door and growled at her to get out, but saw Cain there, who, frightened, said that since he was out of sorts, Cain would come to Joshua later. Joshua said that he thought it wasn't Cain and therefore asked for forgiveness, asked the knight if he had done what the guy asked. Cain said that he finished everything as Joshua asked, but he didn't understand why the guy did it. Smiling, Joshua said that Cain should just believe in him and follow him, with a winner's smile. Then Cain will understand everything.